What would you do if two men knocked on your door, claiming to be HOA police, demanding a fine for your yard, only to realize they are not who they say they are? How far would you go to stop a scam, especially when you're a retired FBI director? This is a story of deception, bravery, and justice. Keep watching to find out how it all unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Marcus Bennett had always valued peace. After serving as the director of the FBI for over 20 years, he had earned his rest. Now, in his mid-50s, Marcus had retired to a quiet suburban neighborhood in Chicago. The small, tidy house, surrounded by leafy trees, offered him the kind of tranquility he longed for. It was a place far from the chaos of federal investigations, a place where the biggest concern was which neighbors would stop by for a barbecue. But the peace didn't last long. One quiet Tuesday morning, as Marcus sat in his favorite recliner, sipping his coffee, the silence was abruptly shattered. A loud, insistent knock echoed through the house. Marcus frowned, setting his coffee down. He wasn't expecting anyone. Still, he got up, walked to the front door, and peeked through the peephole. On the other side stood two men, both dressed in dark blue uniforms. The patch on their chests read "Neighborhood Enforcement," which immediately struck Marcus as odd. He had lived in several neighborhoods throughout his career, but he had never once seen an HOA, Homeowners Association officer, wearing an actual uniform, let alone two of them. The taller of the two, with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous expression, spoke first. "Good morning, sir. We're here on behalf of the HOA to discuss a violation of neighborhood regulations." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A violation? What kind of violation?" The shorter man, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper mustache, cleared his throat. "Your yard. We've received multiple complaints about it. You failed to maintain it according to community standards." Marcus stood there for a moment, assessing them. The uniforms looked too new, almost like costumes. The gold emblems on their chests gleamed too brightly, and their postures were stiff, as though they were reading from a script. He crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "I've been living here for less than a month," Marcus said, trying to sound casual, "and my yard's just fine. You're telling me the HOA sends out people in uniform for something like this?" The tall man adjusted his glasses, voice trembling. "We are authorized to issue fines and, if necessary, proceed with enforcement. This is a formal warning." "Enforcement?" Marcus echoed, an eyebrow shooting up. "Since when does the HOA have the power to enforce anything, let alone arrest someone for a lawn? I thought they just sent out letters." The shorter man glanced at the taller one, then looked back at Marcus. "This is more serious than a letter," he said, now trying to sound more confident. "You need to pay a fine immediately, or we'll have to take further action." Marcus felt a shift in the air. Something was definitely off here. He had spent his life investigating criminals, and he knew when something didn't add up. He wasn't going to let these two intimidate him. "You're telling me the HOA can fine me for a lawn, and if I don't pay, you'll arrest me?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice neutral but laced with subtle authority. The short man nodded, his stance a little more rigid now. "Yes, sir, we can issue fines up to $1,000. Marcus couldn't help but chuckle to himself. The whole thing felt like a scam. He had seen all sorts of cons over the years, fraudulent charities, fake cops, you name it. But this was too bold, even for scammers. "You'll issue a fine, huh?" Marcus said, folding his arms across his chest. "And who exactly authorized you to do this? You have any proof that you're really from the HOA?" the tall man faltered. We don't usually show identification," he stammered, "but we do have official documents." "They're not for your eyes." "Really?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You have documents but won't show them to me. Sounds like a pretty weak case for enforcing a fine, don't you think?" The short man shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "We don't need to show you everything," he said quickly, "but the fine still stands. If you don't pay, we will have to take further action." Marcus was done playing along. He had learned to read people over his career, and these two didn't have a leg to stand on. Something told him this wasn't just about a lawn. He could feel a wave of adrenaline rising, the familiar rush of suspicion kicking in. "All right, here's the deal," Marcus said. "I'm not paying anything until I see some proof of what you're claiming. Why don't you wait here while I go grab the official HOA documents from my office? I'll be right back." The taller man opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus didn't give him a chance to speak. He closed the door, making sure it was just enough to block their view but not completely shut them out. As soon as the door clicked shut, Marcus' mind was working overtime. Something was very wrong here, and he wasn't about to fall for it. He moved quickly, heading toward his office. His heart raced, but he kept his breathing steady. He didn't want to give them a reason to think he was panicking. He had a feeling these two were playing a dangerous game, and it wasn't just about a lawn. Inside his office, Marcus stood in front of his filing cabinet. He didn't need the HOA guidelines. They wouldn't help. What he needed was something much more convincing, his real FBI badge. He had kept it with him for years, even after retirement. It was a reminder of the life he had led, the justice he had served, and the power that still rested in his hands. He grabbed the badge from its hiding spot in the top drawer and closed the cabinet. With a calm but purposeful stride, he walked back toward the front door, his badge tucked inside his jacket. He was done playing their game. When Marcus opened the door again, he was no longer pretending to be just a homeowner. He was Marcus Bennett, FBI director. The two men stood frozen, eyes widening as they saw the badge in his hand. "Now, gentlemen," Marcus said coolly, "I think it's time we end this little charade." As soon as Marcus closed the door behind him, the peaceful suburban morning seemed to vanish. His mind began racing, each thought more urgent than the last. His fingers gripped the brass doorknob tightly as if the motion might steady him. He had dealt with countless dangerous situations over his career, but nothing had ever felt as bizarre as this. Something about these two men was completely off. Walking swiftly down the hall of his new home, Marcus' pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sharp instinct that had kept him alive through decades of high-stakes investigations. These men, these so-called HOA police, were not who they claimed to be. His gut told him this was not just some minor dispute over yard maintenance. No, this was something bigger, and his experience told him exactly what to do next: get answers. He entered his small home office, which was far from being fully set up. Cardboard boxes filled with papers and personal items were stacked along the walls, but in the back of the room, behind a cluttered desk, was the object that had made him one of the most formidable figures in the country: his FBI badge. Though he had retired from his post as FBI director just months ago, he had kept the badge close, always within arm's reach. In the midst of a world filled with ordinary people and routine tasks, the badge represented the power, the authority, and the duty that would never fully leave him. With deliberate movements, Marcus opened the drawer of his desk and retrieved the badge. The familiar weight of it brought a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about a fake fine over a patch of grass. This was about someone trying to intimidate him, and Marcus Bennett didn't respond to intimidation. He straightened his shirt, sliding the badge into his jacket pocket, and returned to the front door. His breathing had slowed, his mind clear. The moment he would reveal his true identity was nearing, and the fake HOA officers would know just how dangerous it was to mess with a retired FBI director. As he turned the handle and swung open the door, the two imposters were exactly where he had left them, waiting awkwardly on the porch. Their false confidence faltered when they saw him walking back toward them, his posture different this time. No longer a homeowner merely trying to avoid a fine, Marcus now held himself as someone accustomed to facing threats head-on. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice calm and measured, "I think we need to have a real conversation." The taller man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from Marcus to the street, as if considering making a run for it. The shorter one, still with the salt and pepper mustache, opened his mouth but seemed to lose his words. They were clearly unprepared for what was coming. "I've given you the benefit of the doubt," Marcus continued, pulling the FBI badge from his pocket and flashing it in front of them. "But I think it's time to end this charade. I'm Marcus Bennett, retired FBI director, and I'm afraid you're in over your heads." The reaction was immediate. The short man took a small step back, his mouth hanging open, eyes wide. The tall one blinked rapidly, his face draining of color as if he had just realized he had been caught in a trap. For a brief second, Marcus saw genuine fear flicker in their eyes, but it was fleeting. The taller man recovered first, his expression turning from panic to something more defiant. You can't do this. We're doing our job," he stammered, his voice shaking but attempting to regain composure. "Your job," Marcus repeated, almost incredulous. He let out a short laugh. "Your job, gentlemen, is to impersonate law enforcement and extort money from innocent people. That's not a job. That's a crime." The two impostors glanced at each other, exchanging a quick, silent look. The taller man took a hesitant step forward. "You don't know what you're talking about. We have the authority here. You can't just—" Marcus cut him off. "You're trespassing and committing fraud. You've got no authority to do anything but walk off my property right now, or I'll have you both arrested for impersonating law enforcement officers." The shorter man was shaking his head now, as though trying to find a way out of the mess they were in. "Look, we can explain everything. It's just a misunderstanding. We're not who you think we are." "No," Marcus said firmly, taking a step toward them. "I don't think you understand. You're in my neighborhood now, and I'm not going to let you scam people. Not on my watch." His voice was unwavering, calm but intense. The impostors had no response. For a moment the street was silent, only the faint rustling of leaves breaking the stillness. The tall man looked like he was about to speak again, but Marcus wasn't done. "I want you both to kneel on the ground," Marcus ordered, his voice low but unmistakably authoritative. "Hands behind your heads. Now." The two men froze, their eyes wide, mouths slightly agape. It was as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. For the first time, they seemed to realize just how serious this situation was. They were no longer the ones calling the shots. Marcus stood there, his stance unwavering. His experience in dealing with criminals and dangerous situations had taught him how to handle this. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to escalate things further than necessary. His presence alone was enough to make them hesitate. They had no idea who they were up against, and Marcus intended to make that clear. The shorter man, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and fear, reluctantly dropped to his knees, quickly followed by the taller one. They complied as if they had no other choice. It was almost comical. Two grown men kneeling on the ground in front of Marcus Bennett, the man they had mistakenly assumed was just another homeowner. "Now," Marcus continued, his voice a little firmer, "I want you to stay exactly where you are while I make a call." As he spoke, Marcus stepped back toward the door. He didn't need to do much more than show his badge, but he was going to make sure everything was on the record. His hand brushed against his pocket as he reached for his phone, ready to call the local authorities. He couldn't trust these two to leave quietly, and he wasn't about to let them walk away and scam someone else. The two men continued to kneel, their faces down, trying to figure out how to handle this turn of events. They had come here thinking they could intimidate someone, but they had picked the wrong house and the wrong man. Marcus had been in far more dangerous situations before, but in this moment, it wasn't danger that fueled him. It was a sense of justice. "Get ready for a long night, gentlemen," Marcus muttered as he dialed the police. Marcus stood with his feet firmly planted on the porch, arms crossed, as he surveyed the two men kneeling in front of him. It was clear from their postures that they were rattled, trying to hide their fear behind forced composure. The taller man, his hands trembling slightly, kept glancing at Marcus with a mix of defiance and desperation. The shorter man, though visibly uncomfortable, tried to maintain his stance, though his eyes darted around as if seeking an escape route. Marcus was calm, but his mind was already calculating what came next. He had always believed in the importance of getting every detail right. Years of investigative work had taught him how to read people, how to notice the smallest of signs that something was amiss. And right now, everything about these two men screamed fraud. "Let's take a closer look at what you've got on you," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, authoritative. He took a step closer to the kneeling men, his gaze cold but sharp. "Start with the belt." The short man stiffened, his lips pressed tightly together. He clearly didn't want to comply, but he had no choice. He reluctantly unclipped his belt, letting it fall to the ground as Marcus motioned for him to move aside. The tall man, now sweating, seemed to know exactly what Marcus was after. He attempted to make himself small, but Marcus wasn't letting them off that easily. Bending down, Marcus quickly examined the short man's belt. He immediately spotted a pair of handcuffs hanging from it, cheap-looking, flimsy. They weren't the kind used by legitimate law enforcement. The metal seemed too thin, the clasp too loose. It was nothing more than a prop, a tool to lend a false air of authority. Marcus' eyes narrowed. "Fake," he muttered to himself. As he stood back up, he kept his eyes on the men, now carefully inspecting the rest of their gear. The tall man had a small canister attached to his utility belt, just like a police officer might carry. But this wasn't a standard pepper spray canister. The design was too basic, the lettering too generic. Marcus reached for it, unscrewing the cap. He tilted it slightly and sniffed the air. Nothing. The canister was filled with nothing but air, a decoy meant to intimidate. "Pepper spray," Marcus said, lifting the canister up for them to see. His voice was calm but had a sharp edge. "Or should I say air freshener?" The taller man flinched, his face reddening. It's part of the job," he stammered, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. "For protection." Marcus didn't respond, but his eyes never left the man. This wasn't protection. This was deception. He turned his attention back to the short man. "I'm going to take your phones now," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Both of you." With quick efficiency, he took their phones from their pockets, scanning them briefly. Neither man seemed to have a real connection to an actual HOA, but the devices held something else. Messages between them, details about clients, and a series of vague instructions that made it clear they were operating a scam. Marcus kept his calm exterior, but internally, his anger simmered. These two weren't just trying to get away with a fake fine. They were building an entire operation based on impersonating law enforcement, harassing innocent people, and stealing their money. And Marcus wasn't going to let them get away with it. As he continued to inspect their tools, Marcus' mind shifted to how deep this could go. This wasn't an isolated incident. People like these men, operating under false pretenses, could cause untold damage if left unchecked. He knew the severity of what was at stake. The imposters, realizing they were cornered, started to act. The short man shifted nervously, attempting to stand up. "Look, we don't want any trouble," he said, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is all just a misunderstanding." Marcus stepped forward, his hand moving to his pocket to retrieve his phone. "It's no misunderstanding," he said, his voice unwavering. "You're both under arrest for impersonating law enforcement. I'm calling the police." The two men froze. The tall one looked over his shoulder as if considering making a break for it, but Marcus was already one step ahead. He knew they couldn't outrun the consequences now. They'd underestimated who they were dealing with. Marcus punched the number for the local police into his phone. It rang for a few seconds before an operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? "I'm a retired FBI agent," Marcus stated flatly. "I've caught a couple of men impersonating HOA police in my neighborhood. They're trying to extort money under false pretenses. I need officers here right now." The operator's voice turned serious. "We'll dispatch a unit immediately. Stay on the line." Marcus kept his eyes on the two imposters as he spoke. Neither man made a move. They were trapped. The tall man, realizing the weight of his situation, shifted uneasily, but Marcus didn't give them any room to maneuver. "You're going to stay right there," Marcus ordered as he turned off the phone and put it in his pocket. "And if either of you tries to run or cause trouble, I'll make sure the police know exactly what you've been up to." The men were no longer speaking. They were breathing heavily now, and Marcus noticed the way their shoulders sagged. It was a sign that the game was up. The facade had crumbled. They had no way out, and they knew it. Despite their efforts, Marcus wasn't about to let them off lightly. He had seen too many criminals over the years who thought they could get away with their schemes. They had learned nothing from their own failures. But this time, Marcus wasn't going to let them simply disappear into the ether. He would make sure they faced justice. "Don't move," Marcus reiterated one final time. His voice was cold now. "This ends here." The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. The imposters had no response, no further tricks up their sleeves. They were caught, exposed for who they truly were. Marcus took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that his years of training and experience had once again guided him to the right decision. As he stood there, watching them carefully, Marcus knew that this was far from over. The local police would take care of the rest, but Marcus still felt the rush, the same rush that had carried him through countless high-stakes situations in his career. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing justice served, no matter how small the crime seemed. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the stillness. Marcus' resolve only strengthened. The game was over for these two, and the law would soon catch up with them. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He would make sure no one else would be taken in by the same scam. As the sirens grew louder, Marcus felt his mind already shifting forward, preparing for whatever came next. These men would face the consequences, and he would see that they didn't slip through the cracks. The tension in the air was thick. The two men, kneeling on the porch, were no longer acting with the bravado they had when they first arrived. They were now clearly aware that they had been caught, and that Marcus wasn't just some unsuspecting homeowner. They had underestimated him in the worst way. But there was something else in the way they held themselves, a flicker of hesitation, a faint look of desperation that told Marcus they were preparing for something. Marcus didn't miss the subtle exchange of glances between the two imposters. It was a momentary look, barely perceptible, but Marcus had seen enough in his years as an FBI agent to recognize it for what it was, an attempt to communicate, to plan their next move. They were about to make a break for it. He stood tall, keeping a close eye on both men, his hand near the phone in his pocket, ready to call the police. But the taller of the two men broke the silence first. He shifted slightly on his knees, his body language stiffening. "We're not going to stay here for you to accuse us of something we didn't do," he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice trembled slightly. Marcus didn't flinch. "Stay down. I'm not telling you again." But the man wasn't listening. In a sudden burst of motion, he shoved himself off the ground, pushing with surprising strength. He shot up to his feet in an attempt to break free from the situation. His movements were quick, but not quick enough. Marcus had seen this kind of thing before, criminals trying to make a run for it when they realized the game was up. Before the tall man could get far, Marcus moved forward, placing himself directly between the imposter and the open street. He had anticipated this move and was already prepared. Marcus didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply extended a hand, blocking the man's path. "Not so fast," Marcus said firmly. "You're not going anywhere." The taller man hesitated, his face flashing with frustration. He opened his mouth, possibly to argue, but in that instant, the shorter man made his own move. He bolted up, attempting to escape the same way. His actions were panicked, fueled by a mixture of fear and the realization that they had no way out. Marcus reacted quickly. With one smooth motion, he grabbed the short man by the arm and spun him around, bringing him back down to the ground. He didn't hurt him, but he ensured the man knew that any attempt to flee would be met with resistance. They weren't going anywhere, not on Marcus' watch. The tall man, now standing just a few feet away, froze, eyes darting to his partner. Both men realized that the window for escape had closed. They were trapped. But desperation fueled their actions. They both exchanged a look, and in that brief moment of communication, Marcus could see their resolve. They weren't going down without trying everything. "Move!" The tall man shouted to his partner, but the shorter man was already backing away, trying to find an opening. In the next instant, the two men rushed towards the street, running with clumsy urgency, their feet pounding against the concrete. Marcus' heart raced for a second, but only a second. As the men began to run, he already had his phone out, his thumb dialing the local police department. He didn't need to chase them down. He knew the authorities would be here soon, and he had something they didn't, the proof of their scam. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the line with urgency. "I've got two men who tried to scam me and impersonate law enforcement," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. "They're on the run, but I've got their description and I've got footage of their actions. Send a unit now. I need them caught." The operator immediately acknowledged and Marcus hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He quickly started recording the scene, his hand steady as the two imposters sprinted down the street. The tall man was leading, his long legs helping him gain some ground. The shorter man, heavier and less coordinated, stumbled a few times but kept pushing forward. Marcus continued to film them, capturing their faces, their frenzied movements. He didn't know if the police would catch them immediately, but he had to make sure the evidence was clear. This wasn't just about making sure they were caught. It was about making sure they didn't escape justice. A few minutes passed, and then, faintly at first, Marcus could hear the sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. The two men hadn't made it far. They were nearing the end of the street, where a small cul-de-sac dead ended. Marcus could tell from their movements that they were losing steam. Panic was setting in. They hadn't planned for this, and it was becoming clear that their carefully crafted scam was falling apart piece by piece. The imposters turned a corner and reached a run-down sedan parked at the far end of the street. They tried to pile into the car, their motions frantic, clumsy. The taller man fumbled with the door handle, pulling it open just as his partner was half in the car, legs tangled with the seatbelt. Marcus could see it all, his phone's camera capturing every detail. They didn't even notice Marcus following, keeping a safe distance but still maintaining his vantage point. As the sedan's engine roared to life, the short man managed to get in, and they sped off down the street, tires screeching as they ignored the stop sign at the intersection. They were desperate, willing to do anything to escape, but their getaway was anything but smooth. The car swerved erratically, narrowly missing a neighbor's flower bed before turning the corner and disappearing from view. Marcus didn't hesitate. He immediately hit the stop button on his phone, saving the video. He had what he needed, proof of the scam, their faces on tape, and the car they used. Now, it was time for the next phase. He wasn't going to let these men slip away just because they had managed to flee the scene for the moment. The sirens were now blaring, and the flashing lights of the police cruisers began to appear at the far end of the street. Marcus walked slowly to the curb, his mind already working on the next steps. He knew this wasn't going to be as simple as a quick arrest. These men weren't just out to make a quick buck. They were part of a larger scheme, a network that had likely been preying on people for months, maybe longer. As the police arrived, Marcus stepped forward to meet them. He briefed them quickly, showing them the video he had recorded and giving them the description of the car. "They may have gotten away, but we can still track them down," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "This isn't just a random scam. It's bigger than that." The police nodded in agreement, their own suspicions rising. "We'll get to work right away." "We've got the partial plate from the car and we'll track it," one of the officers said. "You did good, sir. You caught them." But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He knew this was just the beginning. If these two had been operating on their own, they wouldn't have been so bold. He suspected a larger network, one that was still out there, potentially preying on other unsuspecting victims. As the officers continued to gather information, Marcus stood back, already piecing together the larger picture. This was far from over. The imposters may have escaped for now, but Marcus wasn't about to let them disappear into the shadows. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers gradually faded as the officers wrapped up their investigation. The cul-de-sac, once filled with the hum of sirens and the low murmur of conversations, began to quiet down. Marcus stood near the curb, watching the officers as they spoke to witnesses, gathered evidence, and made notes. It was clear they were taking the situation seriously, and that meant a lot. But even as the investigation continued, Marcus knew that the case wasn't over. Not by a long shot. His mind was still processing everything that had happened. The two men, those so-called HOA officers, had tried to pull off a well-planned scam, and for a while it had seemed like they might actually get away with it. But Marcus wasn't someone who let things slip through the cracks. His years of experience as an FBI director had given him the patience to track down criminals, no matter how small the offense might seem. His job wasn't done until they were behind bars, facing the consequences of their actions. As the officers finished collecting their information, Marcus slowly made his way back to his home. The day had been long and exhausting, but there was no time to relax. He had to follow up. He had to be sure that these two weren't part of something bigger. They hadn't just targeted him, they tried to scam an entire community. And Marcus couldn't just let that slide. Once inside, Marcus closed the door behind him and dropped his keys into the bowl by the entryway. The house was eerily quiet, and the stillness contrasted sharply with the events of the day. He walked toward his office, the weight of his badge still heavy in his pocket. It was a small reminder of who he was, who he had been, and why he could never completely walk away from the job. Marcus turned on his desk lamp and sat down in the chair, his gaze falling on the phone in his hand. He opened the video app, and the footage of the two imposters, running down the street, climbing into the car and fleeing, played in front of him. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was more than enough. It captured their faces clearly, the desperation in their eyes, the hurried movements as they tried to escape. He watched the video through twice, then paused it on the image of the sedan speeding away. His thoughts drifted as he replayed the events in his mind. They had made a clean getaway, but they hadn't left without leaving a trail. Marcus wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. His investigative instincts were sharper than ever, even in retirement. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. The two men were small fry in the grand scheme of things. But if they were part of a larger scam operation, he couldn't just let them slip through the cracks. He had been around long enough to know that a lot of small crimes could point to something much bigger. These men were likely just the tip of the iceberg. Marcus picked up the phone and called the police department. The line clicked, and an officer answered. "Detective Alvarez," the voice on the other end said. "Detective, this is Marcus Bennett," Marcus began, his tone steady but with a sense of urgency. "I've got more information regarding the two men that attempted to scam me. I don't think this is just an isolated incident. I suspect they may be part of a larger operation." There was a brief pause on the line. "You're not wrong," Alvarez replied. "We've been getting scattered reports of similar scams in other neighborhoods, but nothing as direct as this. We're looking into it, but we could use any help you have." Marcus nodded, though Alvarez couldn't see him. "I'll send you the full video footage. It's not much, but it should be enough to help with the investigation. I also have a partial plate number from their getaway car." "It's a start." "Great, send it over," Alvarez said. "We'll work on it from here. We'll keep you in the loop." Marcus hung up the phone and set to work. He transferred the video from his phone to his laptop and forwarded it to Detective Alvarez. Then he sifted through the notes from the day, detailing what he had seen, what the police had collected, and his own observations. As he sat there, piecing everything together, a small sense of satisfaction began to settle over him. He may have retired from the FBI, but the mission hadn't ended. Justice wasn't something that stopped when you left your job. It wasn't something that could just be set aside. As long as there were people out there trying to deceive others, to manipulate the system for their own gain, Marcus knew he would never truly rest. He couldn't. It wasn't just about these two men anymore. They were part of something bigger, and Marcus was going to make sure they didn't get away with it. Hours passed, and Marcus barely noticed the time slipping by. It was well into the evening by the time he finished reviewing everything. He looked over his notes, replayed the video one last time, and checked the local news. The story hadn't broken yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the police would start making their arrests. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. This was not the peaceful retirement he had imagined, but it was the one he had earned. And in that moment he realized something: he wasn't done. He didn't need to chase after every lead or run every investigation, but there would always be cases that called to him. This one, it seemed, was his. He glanced toward the window, where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The world was still turning. People were still going about their lives. But somewhere out there in the shadows were those who would try to take advantage of others. And as long as Marcus had breath in his lungs, he would be there, ready to stand up for what was right. The phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Detective Alvarez. "We're tracing the plate. This could go deeper than we thought. I'll keep you updated." Marcus smiled faintly. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, and he wasn't going anywhere. Justice wasn't just a job, it was a calling. And no matter where life took him, he would answer it.